to create a journal. So if you're already using it, good luck, and you're away. My focus here is to give you an overview of what it is, and then just primarily focus on the jobs and the planning you need to do in order to get it up and running. So you know yourself, the more planning you do, the less work you'll have. Before I do that, I just want to talk a little bit about Plan S. So Plan S is this new system that's coming in that's really going to be absolutely hammered by the EU for any research funding that they give. So it's obviously relevant, and it's going to force a number of changes in the academic publishing industry, whether they like it or not, and they really don't like it. For what it's worth, I lay my cards out on the table. I think Plan S is wonderful, and I think we should go down that path. I know that there are others at the university who disagree, but what I'm going to talk about won't be affected by that. And then, as I said, I'm going to talk about the open journal system and what you need to think about if you want to go and have a journal, rather than be surprised by things or get yourself into a terrible mess. So Plan S, I'm just going to assume nobody's heard of it. Plan S requires that, as it says here, from 2021, scientific publications that result in research funded by public grants must be published in open access journals or on an open access platform, or made immediately available through an open access repository without embargo. Now, the European Union, and particularly the Horizon 2020 funding, are going to insist on this. This has been coming for 8 years now. The initiative was announced in 2013, and we were told then that this was going to become active as of 2021. Because of the lack of compliance and the lack of movement in this direction, that's been extended to 2023. But as the European Research Council says, they've been committed to this since day one, and they're going to make it mandatory, and it's just going to be the way things are. If you're getting government funding in the EU, they are going to demand that the results of that funding are made through open access journals and are freely available. They're not paywalled and so on. So what does Plan S mean? Plan S, these are icons that you may see around. These are licensing icons. So we now have this concept of Creative Commons licensing, hence the CC. And there are a number of different license types that are handled under the Creative Commons, under the Creative Commons licensing system, and then they've usually got some sort of subclausing behind them, which is indicated with additional rules. And then there are some standardized icons that are now being used. So CC means Creative Commons. The figure here means a culturally significant work. So or you can put this into mnemonics, so CC BY. What does this mean? It means that everything that's published is required to comply with Plan S must come out under this license. So as it says there, anything that's published under this license, you can copy it, you can redistribute it, you can add to it, you can subtract from it, you can pretty much do anything you like with it, including make money off it by using it commercially. And you cannot change those license agreements. So you cannot revoke these permissions on anything you produce. So effectively, the instant you publish under this license, anybody can use that work for any purpose whatsoever, provided they attribute it to you with an appropriate credit, link to the license, specify what changes have been made, and don't use the reworking of your work as some sort of indication that you are endorsing what they've done with it or what they're continuing to do. So at the moment, as far as we can tell, 3% of the commercial journals out there are compliant with this licensing, and of the ones that claim to be open access, only 8% of them give this much freedom to the material in their licensing. So it's going to require some major changes there. One of the things that started to happen is a number of publishers like Springer and so on have simply said, we won't comply. We'll just, if that's the rule in Europe, then you guys will just have to do without our publishing services and so on. So the reason why I'm mentioning this now is I think this actually opens up a tremendous opportunity for new journals. I know there are concerns about citation indexes and stuff like this, but the reality is if the material is good, particularly as it can be more freely distributed, you're going to gather the citations anyway. And to a certain degree, you could argue that not paywalling significant publications and making them more freely available is going to promote the distribution of the knowledge. And if you're concerned about your citations, it's going to probably make for more of them. So, which was exactly how it's intended. It's intended to promote the distribution of knowledge freely. So that's just it in a nutshell. It's something you need to be aware of given the publishing time cycles and so on, and particularly if any grant applications that you're putting in now, you would be advised to specify that you're going to comply with Plan S as part of that and make it a formal component of the research application. And as I say, certainly within the next couple of years, you're going to absolutely have to. It's just going to become a condition. And I would suggest that it's an extremely good way for somebody who's looking at allocating funding to filter stuff out. The first thing I'll do, I just throw out anything that's not going to comply with Plan S, and that simply just limits my workload. I guess that's the sermon. Get with Plan S. Let's have a look at the open journal system. Okay, so the open journal system is an alternative response that Plan S is also responding to. It's a concern about the rise of paywalling of academic publication. What's happened is around about 1999, 2000, there were a number of movements to try and do something about this. In 2002, we saw what's now called the Budapest Open Access Initiative. Budapest Open Access Initiative. And the concern there was that the justification being given for paywalling by the publication companies was it's a technically challenging task to produce a journal. There are a lot of costs involved, not so much the technical costs of hosting a website, but editing, managing submissions and so on, and that this software that is used to manage these processes these days is expensive. Therefore, they're justified in asking for payment for the articles and so on. So the response was, fine, let's make it cheaper. So what was created by a combination of Simon Fraser University, University of British Columbia, and Stanford was this open platform consisting of 4 components. We have the Open Journal System, which we're talking about. We have the Open Monograph Press for doing books. We have open conference systems and for running conferences and so on, and the Open Harvester system, which is designed to provide the indexing and the search capabilities that you would normally get from something like a search within Scopus or Springer and so on. The latter 3 haven't really had a lot of impact out in the world, but the Open Journal System is now the single most popular platform for publishing on in all peer-reviewed journals. So this is an example. This is one I know because I'm a peer reviewer for this. This is Orbit. This has been going for about 5 years now. It's specifically to look at ethical issues in research and innovation, so it's quite tightly focused. It publishes probably 4 or 5 issues a year, and I'm peer reviewing inside Springer journals as well, and realistically, from a peer reviewer point of view, you really can't tell you're in anything special. It's just another peer review system. You can upload your submissions and so on, and it works fine. And I'm using this as an example because I know it on the inside, and because, as I say, it's been running very, very successfully for 5 years. In fact, so successfully that they've just taken on a commercial editing and hosting company to run it, because the volume of papers that are going through it and subscriptions and so on has become well what you can ask any poor research student to do, and it's pretty much now a full-time job. So it's an example that it can work. This started out very small, and you know, it's the quality of the work that has determined the success of the journal, not the platform. So to be frank, I've yet to see anything that Springer or any of these publishers do that adds the value that justifies the cost. I mean, they don't do the peer review. In a lot of cases, they don't do the editing. As I say, Orbit works well. It's very successful. So what does it do? Firstly, for those of you who are involved with websites, it integrates very well with WordPress. WordPress is what we call a content management system. It's designed for producing websites. It started as blogging software, and it now has a huge range of functions. WordPress is now running about 60% of the world's websites. There's no real competitor to it anymore. It's pretty much won that war. Maynooth uses Drupal. Drupal is now down to 2.5% of the world's websites. It was the world's leader, but it's just fading away. It's absurdly complicated for what it does. So if you are running a website, and I've worked on 4 or 5 that are associated projects around the university, and they've all been hosted on WordPress, it's highly unlikely, unless the IT department are building you a website, which they don't do, that you're going to be working on any website that is not on a WordPress platform. It's practically taken over. So that's relevant if you're running other activities and so on, or you want to produce more public publications. The Open Journal system can be fully integrated into your WordPress publication. It handles calls for papers. It will handle submissions. It has a peer review management system in it. It allows for revisions, peer reviewer comments, and so on. It's got a scheduling system, and it enables what we call user management. So this is the ability to give somebody a username and password and set their access rights, the privileges, the things that they're allowed to do or not to do inside the journal system. And it handles all the communication between them. And of course, when you've got your journal ready, it will publish it for you. So right now, I don't have accurate numbers for how popular it is. In 2016, as it says there, it peaked at 11,000. The most recent numbers are about 4 years old now, and we had 9,400 journals and 2.8 million papers. It's fallen off a little bit, but an awful lot of journals that get started with the Open Journal system don't go anywhere. They fade within a couple of years. And in my experience, this is primarily because people didn't plan enough for what you do after you've launched your first copy. So it's very, very easy to plan an initial launch and so on. It's the issue is getting people to do the work on an ongoing basis. Just like in any other voluntary activity, I guess. One of the advantages to it is you have a wide range of options in terms of how you host it. So in the university library sector in the United States, this has been seen as one of the core new functions that libraries consider themselves appropriate to provide to the rest of the university. So some have gone down the track of providing hosting services, others have gone further and provide editing assistance and training and so on. I did a quick survey about a month ago just to see if I could find out what was going on with that. As far as I can see, roughly half the journals being hosted, the Open Journal journals that are being hosted in the US are being hosted by library services. The other half are being hosted by IT departments. There are private hosting companies that will do it for you. I've got a sample from one of those in a moment. There's nobody in Ireland at the moment. There was a company 3 years ago, but they seem to have gone. So if you're looking for dedicated hosting that understands the open journal system, you're probably going to be going to the US. There may be privacy issues over that. Probably not. You're not processing user data, which is really what GDPR is about. Allowing somebody to just register a name and an email address on a US hosting platform isn't really something that has data protection issues itself. What you get is a skeleton. You have to design the appearance, the layout, the fonts, pretty much everything you would do if you were designing a journal from scratch on a blank piece of paper. It's exactly the same thing. You're going to have to pick your citation formatting. The advantage, of course, is that you have completely free control. You can pretty much do what you like. I've seen anything from journals that look pretty much like a printed one with 2 columns and gutters and margins and all that sort of stuff, and I've seen others that really I don't think anybody's put too much thought into what it looks like, and it just looks like a Word document turned into a PDF or something like that, with maybe a bit of page numbering. So you can do as much or as little as you like in that respect. And then, as I say, it'll manage all the processes that are involved, and I'll go through those in detail and what you need to think about. And then there's a subscription module. So you've got a huge range of options in terms of how people can subscribe. So you can have paid subscriptions, you can have free access, and you can have something in between. So you can say things like these people get access to a paper 3 months after it's published, these people get it immediately, and you can pretty much divide it up that way you like, however you like. And it'll index the content. What it will not do is stuff like register it in search engines and so on, and make sure that it's findable on the web. That's something that you'll have to do yourself. Okay, so briefly, hosting costs. So this is openjournalsystems.com. They are specialists in hosting open journal systems. They're hosting 500 journals at the moment, with roughly 8,000 users. So that's a rough idea of how many people you've got registered for access to those journals. That's not to say that that's the number of readers, because of course a number of these are freely available, and you wouldn't know how many people are registered to use them. So at the bottom end, the basic price they've given there is $45 a month. Looking at what they offer, to be frank, if you've only got the one journal, I think that's more than sufficient. It'll give you everything you need. You can go for the $60 a month one if you're running more than one journal, but for a single journal, the basic price of what's that, roughly €40 a month would be more than sufficient. And they can give you a bit of training and help with it and so on. That being said, it's because of its compatibility with WordPress, you could host it on practically any commercial hosting company anywhere. The only real technical issue would be installing it. And for somebody who knows what they're doing on a website, with access to the software, which you can freely download, a technician could probably get it up and running on a new website in about 30 minutes. There's nothing very complicated about it, and more importantly, there's nothing unusual about it. If you know how to install WordPress, you know how to install this thing. Okay, when it comes down to what do you have to worry about, here are the essential roles. So you need somebody who handles the technicalities of running it. This is somebody who can install it or knows how it's installed, somebody who knows how to maintain the backups, who knows how to keep security up and running. Every website in the world is typically attacked by a hacker around about once every 2 to 3 seconds. If it's popular, you could be looking at hundreds of attacks per second. If you don't have security on your website being actively maintained, it will die eventually. It's inevitable. Hacking is a fact of life, and we've seen some embarrassing incidents around here. There was a website for a particular department who should remain nameless, who found themselves operating a portal to the dark web selling cocaine. They'd been hacked, and in that particular case, they were so wide open and left their security so unattended for so long that realistically the whole website had to just be wiped and restarted. So you do need somebody who can take care of the technology. You do need backups. Computers crash. Nobody makes backups until they've lost everything once, but you should make backups. And again, you'll need a technical person for that. You need an editor. The editor does what an editor does on any journal, anywhere else. They set the policies, the procedures, they oversee the process. And you need somebody to then implement those rules in practicality within the journal. So you need what we call a journal manager. So they are the person who sets up things like, this is the font we're using, this is the layout, 2-column layout, 1-column layout, however it is, this is where the page numbering goes, this is how we do our citations and so on. So, and has to, in a lot of cases, design the forms. It's not a complicated process, it's not a technical process, but they need to understand the technology itself. So if somebody starts talking about user accounts and privileges and which relates to things like is somebody a reviewer or an editor, obviously somebody who's reviewing doesn't need the same type of access as somebody who's actually editing the copy that's going to appear in front of the readers. So these are called access privileges. You need somebody who understands the terminology and who understands how to implement the editor's rules within the technology, which buttons to press, which links to access, which forms to open up, and so on. As I say, they don't have to be a technician, and they certainly don't have to know how to write web pages or anything like that. They simply have to be comfortable with talking to technicians and talking about things like options and systems and procedures and so on. They have to be reasonably methodical. And the reason I'm emphasizing this so strongly is there are some people for whom this sort of tech talk, even though it's not in depth, just makes their eyes glaze over, and they just switch off. And you know, it's like anything else. Some people have an aptitude for it, some people are average, and some people are just never going to get it. You don't need, average will do, but you know, if they have trouble driving Outlook, they're going to have trouble being a journal manager. And then obviously you need people to read and write for the journal. You have these roles, sub-editor roles, whether they're assigned to a single person or they're allocated out individually. It really depends on you. That's a free choice you can make. The system doesn't care, but you need to understand what the roles are. So the section editor is the person who's managing the submission. So they're checking that they're coming in on time, and they're ensuring that they're peer reviewed and so on time. The biggest task there, and it's nothing to do with the fact that it's software, is getting the reviewers to give you their reviews on time. But for those of you who've done that, nothing new there. It doesn't make any difference what the format for the publishing is. That's always a task. You also need your reviewers, of course. People can be registered for those. The subscription manager manages any subscription service that you have. Now, this is an optional role because you may decide that what's published is just freely available. You may decide to be Plan S compliant, in which case you don't need a subscription manager. But if you are taking money and you are doing subscriptions that control access to the material, you will need somebody to control that side of the system. The copy editor does the final editing of the submission. So this is the person who's going to take a finalized paper, go through, make sure that all the editing is perfect, all the grammar's correct, whatever else they need to do, and finalize it and send it on to the layout editor. Now, again, whether that person is also the section editor or the journal manager or the editor themselves, it really depends on you, but that is a formally defined role within the system and its processes that needs to be allocated to somebody. Then somebody has to turn that into what appears in the journal. So this is where they're taking the raw text and they're placing it into the journal publishing system, which will then follow a bunch of rules that you've set up earlier to control the font and the layout and so on. The system can produce PDFs, it can produce HTML, which is the code that's used for web pages. So effectively what I'm saying is the system can produce something that is a web page, and it can also produce something that comes out as a PDF that people can download. Most of the people that I've seen using this system do both. One for online reading and one for downloading. The system is not compatible with any word processing software like Pages or Microsoft Word. So it's not going to do anything on that. It will allow you to load those documents in, but once they go into the system, they're out of Word format and they're running through the Open Journal system. Effectively, what it has to do is it has to strip the text from any formatting and store the raw text into a database so that they can then apply the formatting rules that are unique to that journal for producing the final output. So obviously, once it's gone to that point where it's no longer a Word document or a Pages document or anything like that. So it can stay in Word until the point where it's ready to go to print, if you like, and at that point it's out. And then you may, well, you should have a proofreader who just checks that before you let the public loose on this thing, it is the way it needs to be. Now, as I say, whether these roles are one person or multiple people, it's completely up to you. But you need to, before you start publishing and laying out things like your publishing cycles and stuff like that, you need to identify who's going to do this work. To a certain degree, it may very well affect how often you choose to publish, because there's a certain amount of work to be done over and above getting the papers in to get it out to the public. And you, as far as I can see, the journals that are failing because they simply don't have people prepared to put in the work, and they've designed effectively a journal that simply asks too much of the volunteers that are working on it. I think Orbit were quite careful here. What they did when they launched was they said, we're going to start with one issue a year. If we get enough material and we think it's justified, which I took to mean, and we think we've got the staff to do it, we will publish more frequently. And so they published one, and then they published another one at 9 months. It was a little early, and then they said, okay, we're going to move to twice a year, and then very quickly they moved to 4 times a year, and they've done that for 2 years, and now they said, okay, now we're actually going to hire staff to manage it. But they're not planning on increasing the cycle, but they've recognized that the amount of work has gone up. I guess that's what you want. If it's successful, you know, you'll have more coming in. So here's an example. This is what it looks like. As I said, it's not trying to do anything fancy here. It's not pretty. So these are a number of papers that have come in. You've got an ID against each one. You've got when it was submitted, what section of this journal it's going to. Your journal may or may not have different sections. Some people use this as a way of handling issues. So if they've got special issues coming up, but they've also got other issues in between, they will use this way of tracking which papers are going to be published when, who they're from. And then you can see here, this is a clickable link. So this would open up the paper. And I can see here that the peer reviewers have been asked these 3 times. to review it. These would be 3 different people, and when they're due, and whether they've done them, and what they said, and who the section editor is for that. And again, you can you've got searches for this, and you can see the different stages. So which you can just have a look at what's being reviewed, what's currently being edited, what hasn't been assigned to anybody yet. So the person who's managing the peer review process would use this to keep track of what's coming in and what stages things are at. This is an example of what they would then do if they clicked in to look at a particular review request. They would see this is an individual reviewer's record. So you can see when they were requested to do it, when they indicated on the system that they had started, when it's due by, and you'll notice you can do a few things here. So you can make comments on the reviewer. These are never seen by the reviewer. These are where you put things like, don't forget to send him a reminder he's always late, and stuff like that. So this is internal comments. You can add files to it, and you can send out acknowledgement. You can see that an acknowledgement was sent out, and you can see this little icon tells you emails were sent, and so on. And you can also score your reviewer and keep track of the quality and whether you want to waste your time with them anymore. And then we have a list of reviewers, so it'll keep a database of reviewers. You can see the name here. Again, clicking on the link is going to open up that record we've just seen. You can see the sorts of things they're interested in, how many they've done, what the average turnaround time in weeks is. So this particular individual is averaging 14 weeks to turn stuff around. Whether this person, who we are probably going to use more frequently, has only done 1, but he did turn it around in 6 weeks. And so you would have this open when you had a paper open, and you can then just click to assign that paper to it. And you can also create, as it says there, create new reviewers. And if you've got a lot of reviewers, you can do a search through different types of interests. Now, again, if you are going to start running a lot of reviewers, this is something you need to think about. You can't allow people working in the team to just make up their own categories for people's interests. You'll have to have a standardized list. Otherwise, you won't be able to search properly. So the way I've seen that done most effectively is when somebody volunteers to be a reviewer, there are a series of tick boxes of things. So the general rule is if they tick, you get the text that you design, whereas if you ask them to write, they can describe the same thing in 1,000 different terms. So wherever possible, give them tick boxes or drop-down lists, things like that, to indicate their interests with. And again, as I say, you'll have to think about the terminology you're going to use to describe the interests of the reviewers before you can launch your journal, because you'll have to have that stuff ready. So this is a nice, relatively nice, simple flowchart showing the process. You'll have the author submits the file. That goes into the queue. By then we should have one of these people, the journal manager, having set up and configured and enrolled people. That information is then processed here when it goes into the queue. That goes into the submission review section, and it will stay there until the final review. The editor, once it arrives, has to then pick the reviewers, get the reviewers to agree. You saw that when there was a little icon next to the reviewer's record to say at what point they had agreed to review the paper. So they've got to come back to the website and click and indicate that they have done so. One of the things I've started to see people doing is sending out reminders for that, because there seems to be sometimes people may or may not be interested, but they don't respond. And then you basically cycle through this process of the reviewer submitting their review, that going back to the author. All of this stuff is handled automatically by the system, unless you choose to intervene. And then at some stage, the thing is finalized. And then it goes through to the final editing. Once it's ready to go to, for want of a better term, print, the author will be notified. Again, the system will take care of that. Once you indicate that the paper is at that stage, the author will automatically be notified. They can go in and do the proofreading, and then hopefully nothing further will happen, and it'll then go out into publication. But there may be a couple of cycles of going backwards and forwards through that. And then you can do your publication. When you publish, you can choose the style of publication, so you can choose whether everything's available immediately. You can choose that some items are held back for a period of time from public review. And as I said, if you're running a subscription model of any form, then you can control the subscribers' access to the papers differentially as well. So you've got an awful lot of options in there, pretty much as you want to do. What generally happens is most people, where this is important for them, are doing a combination of it's instantly available to all versus this is subscriber limited for typically 3 or 6 months. And for the most part, those are papers where there's some industry involvement and they want some sort of control, or they're doing some sort of paid subscription and they want to basically give first access to those who have paid. The system will make the paper search indexable. That is to say, it can be read by the search engines and listed. Not everything that's published on the web can be read by search engines, and obviously if it can't be read by search engines, it can't appear in a search engine and it can't be found. But it is up to the technical people to actually get it into the search engines. So there are additional files that a search engine likes, it doesn't demand, but it likes, called sitemaps and so on, which give it a list of the pages in a website and the priority to which it should read them, because a search engine will rarely read an entire website in a single visit. So Google, for example, will typically read about 6 to 10 pages every visit and may not come back for another 3 or 4 months. So a sitemap will tell it, if you're going to only read some stuff, read this stuff, and this is how frequently it's updated and so on. So that sort of search engine optimization work, as it's known as, needs to be done by somebody outside the journal. And this is really important, because one of the things that frustrates me working on any number of projects is to see really, really good work put up on the web, but nobody ever finds it because they never bothered to get it into the search engines. Search engines don't proactively go around the world looking for material to list. They don't have to. They've got more than enough. After all, in Google's case, it only needs 10 results. First page, no one goes to the second page, except in Ireland, where 13% of the population go to the second page, and that's unheard of anywhere else on Earth, and nobody knows why the Irish do that. Google would really like to know. But for the most part, if Google's got 10 results, that's good enough. So if you want to be found in the search engines, that's something you have to do. Okay, so absolute minimum, what do you need? You need a technical person to take care of the hosting and the tech support. You need an editor at the top of the tree. You may want sub-editors, but if you're the editor and you're happy to do absolutely everything yourself, then you can run a journal single-handed. You need somebody to do the visual appearance. I would not go to a commercial branding agency. They will cost you a fortune and give you a lot more than you would ever need. Any decent graphics designer or small local print shop is more than capable of coming up with the level of stuff you need. So, you know, if you spend more than $1,000 on that, you're really spending more than you need. And then you need somebody to go out and get you readers. So even if you're not doing a subscription system, you need some way of notifying people, and you need a mailing list of people to contact to let you know that it's there. And then, as I say, I think you need an external connections manager, as I'm calling them. Uh, DOIs, ISBNs, none of that stuff happens automatically. ISBNs or DOIs, I think, are incredibly useful and invaluable. I'm sure you've used citation software that'll grab all the details just from one of those. They have to be done manually. Any registration and catalogs, search engines I've talked about till the cows come home, and so on. So you need somebody who's going to take this entity that you create and connect it to the rest of the planet. It's not a lot of work. It's not technical at all. It's perfect research student work. It's just a question for a DOI or an ISBN of just going to the appropriate place and registering it and getting it, and so on. What do you need to think about? You need to think about your visual design. You need to think about what is the layout, the citation formatting. You need to design your editorial policies. Don't forget, first issue, you're going to have those written out anyway. You're going to have guidance for authors. All the stuff that you go through when you're writing for a new journal, all that information they give you on style, format, tone. They may have rules on quotations, things like this. You need to have all of that formally written before you can even start asking for submissions. So you really need to have effectively the skeleton of the journal there. Everything bar the actual papers themselves needs to be pre-planned. You need to develop your policies and so on for content and publication. And then, you need somebody who's going to stick around and maintain it. And particularly if you are doing subscriptions, you'll need a GDPR requires that you have a privacy officer, that is a named individual who people can contact to find out what information you're holding on them and so on. Request a copy of their records. Again, that's something you need to teach people who are managing reviewers. Don't write inside this record, "This is an awkward so-and-so who's constantly giving me a hard time," because theoretically under data protection, that person could one day ask to see that record. So you need a little bit of training there in terms of how things are worded and so on. And you do need backup, because these things do break, and a proper backup should be able to restore a website within about 30 minutes. If it's being maintained.